All right, so we are back. So let me go ahead and play from current slide. All right, so last lecture we ended on different perspectives. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me just minimize this and drag this here. All right, so we talked about some different fields of psychology, like developmental and social psychology, for instance. But even within those different fields of psychology, there are different perspectives that you could interact with and use to inform your research questions. So, for instance, there's the biobehavioral perspective, the cognitive perspective, evolutionary, positive psychology, psychodynamic, and social cultural. So, let's jump in by discussing the biobehavioral perspective. And I'm going to start with my laser pointer. All right, great. We're going to start with biobehavioral perspective. All right. So, the biobehavioral perspective, as it probably sounds like, focuses on studying human behavior by understanding the human brain and body and their interactions. And this can include things like genes. So, one model that I used a lot in graduate school was the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat. And this is using information from your heart and your blood vessels to measure the mind. So generally, in very stressful situations, your heart beats harder and faster. But what determines what physiologically or physiological profile determines whether you are experiencing threat or challenge depends on the constriction and the amount of blood that is pumped through your body. And we can actually measure this in the lab. So, if you're experiencing threat, so let's say you encounter a bear and you're hiking and you've never encountered a bear before, you don't know how to deal with a bear, you might be experiencing psychological and physical threat. So, you don't have the resources necessary to overcome this challenge. You don't know whether to walk backwards, whether to run, whether to climb a tree. Don't climb the tree. Bears are pretty good at climbing trees. So, because you're experiencing psychological and physical threat, if we were to connect you to different machines that could measure your blood constriction and your amount of blood that's rushing through your blood vessels, we would see constriction and less blood pumped. If you were a person who worked at the zoo and normally dealt with bears and knew how to approach a bear or leave the situation and survive, you would be experiencing something called challenge. So this is when you have enough resources to deal with a threat. So if we were to measure your heart, we would find dilation in arteries and more blood pumped. So that's a very clear example, but there are other examples where you might not be able to tell us whether you're experiencing challenge or threat, or you might not want to tell us that you're experiencing challenge or threat. For example, if we're putting a racial and ethnic minority and a white person in a social interaction together, it might not be appropriate to indicate that you're feeling nervous or you're feeling challenged or threatened by that interaction. So, one way that we can get around people's self-report, which may not always be accurate, is by measuring biological indices like the constriction of your arteries and how much blood is pumped through your body. So now let's go through the cognitive perspective. So, in the cognitive perspective, um, we think of the human mind as being really good at processing very complex information. So, we see the mind as a processing device, similar in many ways to what we would consider an organic computer. So, the cognitive perspective really focuses on thinking, learning, memory, intelligence, and language. So, one way that we employ the cognitive perspective in social psychology is by using something called base images and creating stimulus with random noise. So, for instance, we have a base image, we add the random noise on top of the base image, and this gives us this stimulus once we sort of morph these images together. And then we have this base image, we have inverted random noise, so very similar to this noise, but it's inverted. And then that creates this image. So even though the base image is the same, you can tell by looking at these two different stimuli that the faces look very different. So normally, if you were to go in an experiment like this, you might be asked to indicate which face looks more like an in-group member, which one looks more like an out-group member. And if we talk about some of the differences in these faces, so this one looks more neutral. This face looks like it has a longer, more angry or upset face. The eyes look a little clearer here, and they don't look as happy here. So what I would speculate is that most people would select this face as an out-group member and this face as an in-group member. Now, the differences between the different stimuli. Okay, so in an experiment like this, you're presented with the two faces side by side, and you're asked to select which face represents an in-group member. So you go through hundreds of trials where you select the face that you think is more of an in-group member, and then you might go through another few hundred trials where you select a face that looks more like an out-group member. So after you go through those hundreds of trials, what researchers do is that they compile all of the faces together and create one in-group face and one out-group face. So although the differences might seem minute when we're just looking at one stimulus versus another stimulus, once you actually superimpose all of the different faces together, this is what an in-group member looks like, and this is what an out-group member looks like. So this is taking your mental image of what a person of your in-group looks like, probably someone who's more pleasant, probably someone who's friendly, and so on and so forth, relative to an out-group member, someone you might know it as much, someone who might not be as friendly, someone you need to be wary of. And we see those distinctions in your mind's eye through the selection of the different stimuli. So for instance, the in-group member, their eyes are a lot more refined. A lot of their features seem to be a lot more refined, and they seem more pleasant looking than the out-group member, which seems a little more fuzzy, and I would say maybe more masculine and more angry. So by selecting these pictures that you think, well, they're not really that different, but I'll just say this is more of an in-group member, this is more of an out-group member, it actually gives us some insight into what your mind is perceiving as facial characteristics that describe an in-group versus an out-group member. All right, so now we're going to jump into the evolutionary perspective. So this perspective explains how the human brain and mind have evolved in very specific ways to help our ancestors solve the sorts of problems that they experienced over evolutionary time. So this is like William James and their colleagues. So I'm gonna, it's okay. Um, I'll fix this slide before I put it up on our lecture, but I just said what this evolutionary perspective was about. All right, so one of our faculty in our department, Dr. Jamie Cloud, actually did some work, and she's an evolutionary psychologist. And she published a paper that evaluated the effect of mate value discrepancy on hypothetical engagement ring purchases. So Dr. Cloud says few material goods entail as high a cost and carry as little practical value as an engagement ring, which is true, right? An engagement ring, I feel like, is more for show. Despite their obvious signaling value, engagement ring expenditures have rarely been studied. The purpose of the current study was to experimentally manipulate a discrepancy in the physical attractiveness of romantic partners to determine its effect on hypothetical engagement ring purchases. We predicted that men would purchase larger and more expensive engagement rings when imagining themselves mated to a more attractive relative to a less attractive woman, and women would desire larger, more expensive engagement rings when imagining themselves mated to a less attractive rather than more attractive man. And this is what they actually found. That men in these hypothetical situations tended to buy a bigger engagement ring for someone that they perceived to be more attractive than themselves, and women themselves, if they perceived themselves to be more attractive than their mates, they expected a larger engagement ring. So this is just showing how, from an evolutionary perspective, one way that we're showing mate value is through the purchase of an engagement ring. Of course, one of the limitations of this study is that it does have to do with heterosexual relationships relationships, but it would be interesting to expand this in non-heterosexual relationships. All right, let's jump into positive psychology. So positive psychology uses psychological science to study human strength and positive attributes. So some of the topics that positive psychologists use include resilience, so the ability to cope with adverse experiences. So what makes two people that grow up in very adverse circumstances, so for instance, very low income, with parents that are divorced in a very violent neighborhood, and one person ends up graduating from college and the other one ends up in a low minimum wage job and is very depressed. What is the difference between these two people? And one argument is that it's the psychological protective mechanism of resilience. Other researchers study things like happiness. What makes some people happy versus not? And is it possible for all of us to achieve an adequate level of happiness? The psychodynamic perspective, we talked about Freud, which argues that human beings are strongly affected by unconscious conflicts and motivations that may be expressed in their behavior and personality. And then we have the sociocultural perspective. And in this perspective, researchers focus on exploring the role that culture and or society plays in shaping human society. And one of my favorite theories from this perspective, I'm going to take a sip of coffee, give me a minute, is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this hypothesis argues that the structure of language determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of things. So for instance, the word key in Spanish and German has different pronouns associated with it. So in Spanish, when we say key, we use the feminine la llave, whereas in German, I'm not even going to try to pronounce key in German. The way that Herman is gendered is very masculine. So when we ask native Spanish speakers and native German speakers to describe a key, Spanish speakers describe the key as golden, intricate, little, lovely, and tiny, which is associated with the feminization or the gendered nature of the word. Whereas in German, the description is hard, heavy, jagged metal, and useful, which again is consistent with the gendered use of the word key in German. So it's interesting how just the different uses of the word and the use and the associated gendered use of the word can influence how we perceive certain words. One of the arguments that often comes up is whether psychology is a science. And yes, I'm going to tell you that it is, and I'm going to show you that it is in future lectures, because science describes a method of conducting research. And we do use the scientific method in psychology, and many of the studies that I've already presented use a scientific method in order to develop their ideas, test their hypotheses, and publish their results so that others can read their results. And we'll discuss this later. All right, so now let's shift to employment in psychology and the ways that we can distinguish psychology in three ways. So we've talked about field of study, we've talked about the different perspectives. So now let's talk about the employment setting. So generally, we can parse the employment setting of psychology or psychologists into two different categories. So the first is academic psychologists. So these are psychologists that are conducting research and teaching for the purpose of advancing knowledge. So that would be someone like me, a professor. There are also applied psychologists. So these are individuals who use psychological principles and methods to address problems of the individual, society, or industry. So for academic psychologists, we would have someone like a professor or someone as a graduate student. Once you get into a master's and a PhD program, it's not so much about learning new material, but it's about employing the material that you've already learned through your undergraduate studies to further knowledge. As applied psychologist, you could work as a consultant. So this would mean something like working for Facebook and assessing whether or looking at the kind of emojis that people use in their chats and wondering whether certain emojis are used in America versus China, for instance. And they've already done that work. You can also be a counselor or therapist. So I think that many of you want to go into the applied psychology route. For careers in psychology, unfortunately, um, many jobs in psychology require a PhD or a master's degree, and many of you are already planning to go to graduate school because you want to become a clinical psychologist, for instance. And these are a few career options for people who major in psychology. You can go into teaching, like me. You can go into research, also like me, but you could also do research for different organizations instead of your own. You can become a clinical psychologist. You could become a counseling psychologist. You could go into social work, or you can get a corporate and marketing job. So this is called a hooding ceremony, and this usually happens when you get your master's or your PhD, happens during graduation. So your advisor is usually the person who hoods you or puts this on you to demonstrate that you've met the expectations of getting a master's or a PhD. So these doctoral degrees are generally conferred in formal ceremonies involving special attire and rites. As of 2009, these are the different sectors that employed people who got PhDs in psychology. 26% went into university settings, 25% went to work for hospitals or health services, 16% went to work for the government or veterans medical centers. Business or nonprofit was 10%, other educational institutions 8%, medical school 6%, and independent practice 6%. So if you earn a PhD, you have a huge range of employment options. What about students who just graduate with a bachelor's in psychology? And this was published in 2012. So the top ranking is mid and top level management. So being an executive or an administrator, working in sales, working in social work, other management positions, working in human resources. So either being personnel or training managers, other administrative positions, insurance, real estate or business, marketing and sales, healthcare like a nurse, pharmacist, therapist, or finance. All right, so that is it for today's lecture. I hope you had a good time watching this lecture, and I will send you all a message to let you know what to expect next. Have a great rest of your week.